Yeah. Hi everybody. It is I, Captain Proton, with the Jimmy Savile show. And here's Jimmy. Jimmy Savile, more like Jimmy No One.
Adored by millions of TV viewers, is now regarded as one of the country's most prolific sex offenders. His preying on young victims and just how he was allowed to carry on abusing children for decades are crimes that shook Britain.
Oh yeah. So here we are, Jimmy the paedophile. Savile.
On the 9th of November 2011, a funeral cortege moved slowly through the city of Leeds.
They shouldn't have given him
They weren't there to say goodbye
a
to royalty or a head
funeral.
of state, however. They'd come to pay their respects to a DJ, charity worker, and much-loved icon.
It was absolutely worshipped.
Yeah, and the pedo.
You couldn't move in Leeds when it was a funeral. The seats were packed solid, you know, traffic was stopped, everything stopped.
At 2 this afternoon, Sir Jimmy Savile's gold coffin made its way down Cookridge Street in Leeds.
Gold, mind you, gold.
Media celebrity today who is more famous than he was then.
Flags at half-mast outside Leeds General Infirmary, where he'd raised so much for charity.
He was a demigod.
I
Just
don't
days later,
think
however,
so.
stories began to emerge that confounded the country. Rumours that had circulated for years were coming true. Jimmy Savile, once the nation's favourite entertainer, was in fact a rapist, a sadist and a paedophile. Jimmy Savile was born in Leeds on the 31st of October 1926. As a young man, he worked as a coal miner before an injury forced him to change career. He became an entertainer and began running several nightclubs in the north of England.
He was a wrong
before
un.
his reputation preceded him.
When Jimmy Savile first came to Leeds, no one knew him, and after a month, everybody in Leeds knew him or have heard of him, because there are outlandish things that he used to do. The way he dressed, the way he did his hair, for instance, you know, just to get himself noticed.
You know, if he came to our house, there'd obviously be a couple of dozen, it could be a couple of hundred people all outside the house and round his car. And, you know, so you would obviously walk down with a big chest and your head held high, you know, saying, is that my uncle, sort of thing. We never went out saying, we've got a famous uncle called Jimmy Savile or anything like that. He was just Uncle Jimmy and that was it, really.
He was a well-known figure in the north of England. He was a sort of an amateur disc jockey who hadn't really broken into television yet.
And he introduced dancing to records, which had never happened before. He started for younger people on a lunchtime, just dancing to records, and it really took off.
Really,
Jimmy Savile began working at the Locarno nightclub in Leeds in the late 1950s. Dennis Lemon was employed by the club and became Savile's unofficial minder.
He tried to give himself this reputation of a tough guy in a restaurant, all this, that and other, and I think he was as soft as anything. He just wanted somebody at his shoulders in case somebody did take a swing.
Even as his showbiz career was taking off, Jimmy Savile began to be dogged by accusations.
When I was talking to the assistant manager one night, and Jimmy came through the door.
You see,
And
wrong
Jimmy,
un.
you know, and just walked straight past us. And I said, what's wrong with Jimmy? He said, a bad boy. He said, he's got a lot in his mind. I said, well, what's wrong with him now? He said, in court tomorrow. I said, what for? He says, messing about with girls. And I thought, well, he may have taken one out and, as the phrase goes, tried it on and it didn't work and they complained about him, you know. And that was that. Nothing else said. Until next time I was on duty, a couple of nights later, and I happened to say, how did Jimmy go on in court? So I said, I never got to court. He got thrown out. Case dropped. And I said, how did he manage that one then? He said, same as he did last time. He said he paid him off.
Having narrowly escaped any charges by paying off his accuser's family,
Paid him off.
Savile apparently felt no need to curb his behaviour.
What's amazing is how brazen he was, how public he was even then. I think he's just an individual who probably felt that he was fairly untouchable. I mean, you know, he was quite an imposing figure.
In 1968, 15-year-old Guy Marsden, Savile's nephew, along with 3 friends, headed south from Leeds in search of adventure. The young teenagers found themselves at Euston Station in London, where they were approached by 2 men.
I would have said about 30 years old, rock and roll, with leather jackets and long hair and that. And they were just saying, you want to come to our place and that. You've got to try to remember that there were no such thing as perverts. There were, but you didn't hear of them. Don't even a name paedophile out then, I don't think.
No.
So we just thought, oh, they like us, you know. So anyway, we ended up going with these back to their flat.
At the time, Guy and his friends were unaware of the motives of the 2 men. Only recently has he found out the truth.
These people would pick people up from train stations, as in younger people. We'd then go to their houses. And then the ones higher up the chain would come to these houses to see who they'd picked up, to take them elsewhere to do whatever they were going to do with them.
Only days later, Guy was stunned when Jimmy Savile himself visited the flat. His first thought was that his family had tracked him down and they had sent Savile to bring him back to Leeds. The truth would be far worse.
And then my Uncle Jimmy came in, and he came in with his vicar and some kids. I thought that my Uncle Jimmy had caught me there because, I mean, I was proper scared, you know what I mean? I was
He's got such beady eyes
I think.
in that
catch me, I caught him.
picture.
Only recently has Guy been made aware that Jimmy Savile, far from being a lone predator, seemingly played an active role in supplying children to a network of child abusers in London.
Now, I have no conception of
Guy
paedophilia
Savile.
or child abuse, I don't. Neither as any other 3. So to us, our thoughts were, it's a party. You know, the people who live there, the man and lady who live there, are going to have a party. And it ended up where we were like huddled together, 4 of us, and then these little kids would come over to us.
A pedo party.
As a naive 15-year-old, Guy was never completely aware of the role he played.
Oh no, you were
He and his
never
friends were unwitting
no.
accomplices in the group's depraved activities.
You'd have been talking from 6-year-old up to, I'd have said 10 at most. So they were young children. And every so often, one of them would go, 2 of them would go. Still never thought nothing whatsoever about it.
These parties would last for days, with various men from all sections of society arriving and taking 1 or more young children into bedrooms and abusing them.
I think most decent people find it incomprehensible that these sort of organisations, rings, whatever we want to call them, exist. But no less incomprehensible than why would anybody abuse a child. That the fact that people come together to do it
Why? Because
seems,
there
in a
are
way,
sick
somewhat more scary.
people in
Because
this
very often we're
world.
talking about people from, well, certainly people from all walks of life, but including people from the upper echelons of society.
To this day, Guy is still unclear as to exactly what role Savile played in the so-called parties.
Oh yeah,
you saw him. I mean, he didn't even speak to us and acknowledge us. Every now and again you might have got a nod. He just seemed to come in, flitter about, you know, whatever they were doing, bringing little ones in and stuff like that, and then he'd go. I've recently found out that I were going to get, well, the police and things have called it groomed, to do what the people down London were doing, i.e. getting the kids and probably grown, you know, older girls and older boys, to go to these parties up here in Leeds and places like that.
In 1969, after a year in the capital, Guy returned to Leeds. Even now, over 40 years later, having witnessed the sordid events in London, he considers that he had a lucky escape.
When I think back, I cringe, because I think he could have ended up in Bournemouth Thames. They could have done out against you, saying you were a bit lonely or something. I think it's only because I was, you know, Jimmy Savile's nephew, my Uncle Jimmy's nephew, that no like that did happen.
As the 1960s drew to a close, it would appear that Savile's appetite for abuse showed no signs of slowing down. As his showbiz career gained momentum, so did his ability to evade the attention of the authorities.
Had a huge amount of power. In everything in life, he used it to get his own advantage.
Oh, a posh. So.
Jimmy Savile, once a cherished national icon,
No,
is
a
now
posh
vilified as an evil sexual predator who hid behind a smokescreen of celebrity in a career that lasted decades. After running several nightclubs across the country, Savile began working as a DJ, first at Radio Luxembourg, and then, in 1968, joining the BBC. One of his early roles was presenter of a topical radio discussion programme called Speakeasy.
He was the presenter. It was another one of Jimmy's PR operations. You know, Jimmy Savile is king, and he certainly was on that programme, as he was on everything he appeared on at the time. And within the BBC, the whole organisation was at his beck and call. Had a huge amount of power, he certainly knew it, and constantly worked on building it round him. In everything in life, he used it to get his own advantage.
After the recording of one particular episode of Speakeasy, Dave was offered a lift home by Jimmy Savile. As they approached Leicester, Savile suggested they pull into a service area for a rest.
So he suggested he was going to get his head down for an hour, and as it was early evening, I said fine, I'd go into the service area and have a meal.
Blood.
Came back after about, three-quarters of an hour to an hour. Tapped on the window of the motorhome to let him know I was here, and lo and behold, two young girls, 14, 15-year-olds, clambered out of the back, looking all scruffy and flustered, followed by Jim. They were scrambling as if they were trying to get away from something. I knew my suspicion, but the fact is that they were running from something. So he didn't say anything. The girls went away. We got back in the motorhome. I said, who were they? Oh, fans, it often happens. But then, total silence. Never said a word. The more and more I thought about it, I thought, I need to tell somebody what my suspicions are.
Of a dirty pedo. Yes.
Raised the matter with a colleague, but was shocked by the response.
He had a word with his line manager, who'd said, it's Jimmy Savile. We can't do anything or say anything about that. You know, we both need to keep our jobs. After that, I never watched him on television once. If he came on television, I switched it off.
Good.
I never watched another Jimmy Savile programme after that.
Good.
In 1975, Savile began presenting the show that would make him a household name.
Jim of Fixie!
The programme was broadcast on Saturday evening.
But now you see how
at its peak, the show
what a lie it was.
the production team opening almost 5,000 letters a day.
It was a lie.
I got letters
Yep,
just bombarded me. There were so
5,000
many
letters a
letters,
day.
and it was up to me to sift them and give them to Jim for his decision. But it was hard, but there was a lot of letters, and it just grew like topsy, and that's how it all started.
Despite his on-screen persona, Savile's attitude to children was apparently different when the cameras were turned off.
Did not like children at all. He tolerated them, but that's about as far as it went for the value of the programme.
I think all children should be eaten at birth. That's for sure.
He had a set rules, and he knew how far he could
Eating
go.
that bird.
Sat down with the chair, but that's as near as it got.
What is apparent now, though, is that this seeming aversion to children was no more than a camouflage to ward off suspicion. A device Savile used throughout his life to stay ahead of the rumours that dogged him.
Yes.
Abusers often are the most credible and charming people that you could meet. They're often very hard-working.
Jimmy should have been in that birth.
Authority within society of some standing. The other common denominator, of course, is that they are highly dangerous to children and can be highly dangerous when cornered. And I think that, you know, there was a man who clearly could be as charming could be, but also was both highly dangerous, extremely threatening and very intimidating when he
Did he have a brown wig? Oh my God.
As well as his TV and radio career, Savile was renowned for his charity work, raising millions of pounds for several charities, including the Leeds General Infirmary and Stoke Mandeville National Spinal Injury Centre.
Jim, because he was Jim, liked high-profile things. Stoke Mandeville was very high profile. It was world famous for its treatment of the paralysed. Leeds General Infirmary was a big teaching hospital. So he generated to things that had quite a high publicity value. And as a result, he benefited, but so did the hospitals.
Jimmy Savile may have raised around 40 million in his lifetime for charity, but looking back, I think it's easy to now see that his charity work was a very convenient camouflage for his activities and helped him gain access to vulnerable, young people, in fact, in hospitals, in children's homes, in events linked to the BBC, and indeed, of course, his involvement with Broadmoor and the fact that he was actually given the keys to Broadmoor.
The keys to Broadmoor Hospital
is home to some of the UK's most notorious criminals. Past occupants include Peter Sutcliffe, Charles Bronson, and Ronnie Cray.
Oh my God!
At Broadmoor for years, but in 1988 he was given a senior role, along with a house on site, and incredibly, access to patients.
The fact that he was given keys to a place such as Broadmoor, that he was allowed to walk the hospital wards where there were vulnerable children in Stoke Mandeville and other places, again, is incomprehensible. And yet nobody seems to be taking responsibility.
Like many adults who abuse children, I think Savile preyed on the vulnerable and the weak. We still don't know the full sort of degree of what he did, but it seems to be the case that he may have even abused disabled children in hospitals.
We now know
he might have.
He did. And at Broadmoor and elsewhere, who were suspicious or indeed had had whispers or even had complaints from some victims, but who I think felt that they would never be believed.
If you're a friend of the Prime Minister, you're photographed with these people, you are, in the public eye. The idea that you might at the same time be abusing children is monstrous.
Here we go with what's called a medical breakthrough.
He had, if you like, all the establishment connections even though he was eccentric, even though he just looked like a complete weirdo, that he was actually fated.
No.
As well
He
as
was
having almost
evil.
unrestricted access to Broadmoor and its patients, Savile also managed to secure regular visits to Duncroft School in Surrey, a residential school that housed young girls who had been sent there by the courts.
The girls at Duncroft were certainly, although intelligent, were vulnerable. But Savile, I think, also worked on the principle that the mixture of his fame and the fact that he was treating them to things like trips to the BBC or trips up in his Rolls Royce, that this was, if you like, a thrill that that they wouldn't get from their normal lives in an institution.
Well,
so I think he gambled on that would, at the time, would actually guarantee their silence.
Anything that moved seemed to be a potential victim for Savile. But he clearly also was clever at targeting lots of very vulnerable victims as well. Girls in a school for troubled girls would have been, manna from heaven.
In 1994, 2 women who had been pupils at Duncroft approached the Sunday Mirror newspaper, alleging that Savile had abused them as teenagers.
They weren't looking for money. They merely wanted to see Savile exposed because they thought he was a hypocrite and found it hard to believe that he was almost gayified in some circles and that he was so well in with very prominent, eminent people.
Although the paper was keen to run the story, the 2 women were understandably wary of the costly and emotionally intrusive libel case that would inevitably follow. They decided.
Now, he wasn't gay.
Once again, Savile's power and
just
reputation had
gayified.
I had no doubt about the veracity of their stories, but they had lost their nerve. In one case, she still had the courage herself, but she didn't want the embarrassment of both her past life coming out or indeed of her being subjected to what would have been a merciless cross-examination by a QC for Savile. Would have to tell them that was what was going to happen. The second woman didn't want to be the lone witness, but also said, and I will never forget this because I think reflects a theme that we now know was common among Savile's victims. She said, "Who's going to believe me, an ex-approved schoolgirl, against Jimmy Savile with all his fame, all his money, and being a house guest of Margaret Thatcher at number 10 and Chequers?" And with hindsight, one knew that she was probably right. Although we didn't run the story, some weeks later, I had a phone call from a QC, George Carman, at the time, then the most famous libel QC in Britain.
George Carman, QC, was one of the country's leading barristers, acting for both celebrities and national newspapers. To the best of his family's knowledge, he had never formally represented Jimmy Savile.
No.
My father spoke to Paul Connew. He was then editor of the Sunday Mirror, and my father had worked with him in terms of giving defamation advice in 5 or 6 different cases, I think. So he knew him reasonably well, and they'd also socialised a bit. So he phoned him on the pretext of talking about something to do with a libel action with reference to the Mirror. And my understanding from Paul is that at the end of the conversation, my father, apropos of nothing, suddenly introduced an observation saying Jimmy Savile's very grateful that you didn't publish that story.
Then he's a cut.
I was astonished.
I was, for a second, I think, taken aback that George Carman knew about it. So my reaction, to George was, "Well, how do you know about it, George? You can only know because Savile's spoken to you." And he sort of gave a rather affirmative sort of chuckle. And my response was, "Well, George, even though we couldn't prove the story because the 2 women involved lost their nerve, I actually believe them." And George Carman paused and chuckled again and said, "Paul, I suspect you may well be right."
I can quite understand he was astonished, because as far as he was concerned, only 3 people in the world knew about that story, apart from the 2 girls. That was himself, the legal advisor, and the journalist who wrote the story. So the fact that my father knew about it, and therefore Savile knew about it, and that my father introduced it in conversation in this way, he found
Pussy! Savile's a pussy! If he's still alive, and there are rumours that he is still alive. But no, he's dead.
Princess Diana and him were friends. Nobody messed with Jimmy Savile because he had connections that were unique, if you like, to somebody in his position. It was like he was the puppet master controlling everything that was going on.
By the end of the 1990s, after a glittering career, Savile's showbiz star was fading. And whilst his TV appearances grew less frequent, his near-constant charity work earned him a knighthood. His armour of respectability was complete. It would be over 20 years later until the full, horrifying truth
The pedo
enjoyed
of
seeing
Leeds.
pain inflicted and humiliation, I suppose.
Jimmy Savile was a national icon until his death in 2011. He is now regarded as a wicked, predatory sex offender who used his connections and reputation to deflect any allegations of wrongdoing. However, the public persona of Savile, the entertainer and showman, was at odds with how people actually viewed him when the cameras were turned off.
Savile had long been regarded as a pretty suspicious figure by a lot of people in journalism, in Fleet Street, at the BBC.
Someone's got my back.
I don't do drugs, I don't do sex, I don't do any of them things that they print in papers today.
I think I've found Savile shifty, grubby, mock humility. He almost invited you to think of him as a slightly grubby, eccentric individual.
I hope that cigar is not lit that you have in your hat.
No, it's not lit.
Jimmy Savile. Did the doctor not tell you to get off that?
Nobody tells me to do anything, baby.
Oh, right.
I tell them what's happening.
I feel that, yes, he hid his darkness in the light.
You've been doing Jim will fix it for 20
Baby.
years. Did anybody ever fix anything for you?
Come on.
Yes, because my case comes up next Thursday.
Right, and I hope you get off it.
Not a big change if I get put away.
Nobody tells me to do anything, baby.
It was almost robotic. Not in his movements, but in his actions. He never ever showed any emotion other than when it was that false smile that he had when he was uttering you up on screen or on air. Never showed any emotion of any kind whatsoever.
A lot of people didn't like him. They didn't like him because of the way... A lot of people called him creepy.
He was.
He used to go around the wards saying things like, oh, you're beautiful, and give me your hand, and he'd take their hand and he'd kiss the back of their hand, and he wasn't terribly popular with the staff.
Whilst people harboured suspicions about Savile, his status as a celebrity and fundraiser meant he was never called to account, allowing him to continue to prey on children, both as an individual and also as part of a group of child abusers. Stephen was only 7 when he began to be abused at home.
My father started it, started being very violent. He used to drink.
Oh no.
And it started from there.
We don't know what he used to drink, though.
Time it escalated quite quickly from just being hit to being kissed and touched, and I don't know how many months before others were involved.
As the abuse got worse, Stephen was handed over to an organised paedophile ring.
I just remember my father coming away really pleased that...
Funny thing with alcohol,
they wanted me
if it's tequila, it makes your clothes come off.
What that meant at the time. And then it was only a few days, I suppose, after that, that I was taken to my first meeting. There was only a few of them.
Bam! Come on now.
And that was
Come on. He was a
Stephen was abused by the group for the
no
next 9
good
years.
Nick,
He
to
would be
put it
collected from home
politely.
at any time, day or night. And on occasions, he would even be picked up from school. He was taken to various locations, including houses and hotels, where he, and often other boys, would be subjected to the most appalling sexual abuse by one or more men.
Nobody questioned it, and sometimes it was during the day or the evening or at night or weekends. That was just part of life, really. And nobody said anything. Not a word. Strange, because they never said don't tell. You hear people say, oh yeah, we were told not to tell. Nobody ever actually said that. But it was made very clear that if you broke the rules, or if you went against the group, you would just disappear. And no one would care. They had their rules, and you had to follow their rules without question. No crying.